Hello everyone, welcome to the first lecture in this series, and this lecture is going to focus on the Columbian Exchange, and we're going to look specifically at the conquistador system in some depth. So we're going to begin this class by noticing something rather odd, which is that by the mid to late 15th century, a lot of European countries were making an increasing amount of money by engaging in trade, both overland and by sea, with the East, predominantly China, but also the Indies, and this was mainly done for spices and for silk. And for a lot of these European countries, this represented an increasing amount of money, which for them was becoming crucially important. And we can't really discuss this period and not talk about Columbus. We all know the story. He sailed the ocean blue with 3 ships, and thinking he was going to reach China and India, instead landed on Hispaniola, which is the modern-day Dominican Republic in Haiti. Now, contrary to popular belief, people at the time actually knew that the world was round, but Columbus and others severely misjudged its size. So Columbus believed that by sailing west, he would actually find a faster way to reach China and the Indies. He'd be approaching China from by sea. Now, the question nobody asks is, why Spain, right? Think about it. Here's this guy, Columbus, who has this idea to reach to reach China. But why Spain? Why would he go to Spain of all other countries in Europe? Why doesn't Columbus leave from London? Why doesn't he leave from Italy or Paris or any other port in Europe? Why Spain? What made Spain unique? Well, it's not the reason you think. You see, and very recently, by the time Columbus makes it to Spain, Spain was actually not one country. It was divided into 2 main countries, Castile and Aragon, and some minor kingdoms in there, that had just recently unified in an event known as the Iberian Wedding, in which the son of the King of Aragon and the daughter of the King of Castile get married and unify the kingdoms. And of course, this leaves Spain in a bit of a quandary because, as Howard Zinn notes, Spain was recently unified, one of the new modern nation states like France, England, and Portugal. But its population, mostly poor peasants, worked for the nobility, who were 2% of the population and owned 95% of the land. And like other states of the modern world, Spain sought gold, which was becoming the new mark of wealth, more useful than land because it could buy anything. So, in order to understand what motivates Spain, we need to sort of understand the difference between gold and land, right? Because you might be thinking, well, Spain's got a lot of land, why would they be in a difficult situation? Well, it's very simple. Land is not fungible the way gold is. You can't pay people in land. You can certainly try, but it doesn't work necessarily. You need gold because you need gold to run your country. You need it to run your government, and you need it to run everything. You need it to maintain a military. You need to do all of these things. And so Spain doesn't pay for Columbus to go to the Americas because Spain is a powerful country. Spain pays because Spain is desperate and will take this sort of risk in order to acquire as much gold as possible, as quickly as possible. And what is interesting is that Columbus also finds a benefactor in the Pope, in the Vatican, for a very simple reason, and that is that if you were to, let's say hypothetically, walk from Italy to China, you'd be going through a whole bunch of countries. You'd be walking through a whole bunch of countries. Predominantly, you would find a lot of these countries in the Middle East, hence the name, because it's in the middle between here and the East. And that is useful for the Pope because all of these countries that happen to follow a different religion, happen to be of the Muslim faith, they levy taxes on traders. They make a lot of money off of traders going from Europe to China into the Indies. And so the Pope had a lot to gain by removing this financial opportunity from the Middle Eastern and the Arabic countries. And so Spain is desperate and is willing to take these risks, and they have benefactors in the Vatican that allow them to pay for Columbus's expedition. And even then, it's not like they spend a whole lot. They only give him 3 ships. They don't give him a giant fleet. They know that chances are he's going to fail, and so they won't have lost much. Now, we all know how this ends. Columbus does find land. It's not China, but he does find land, and he does find gold, and he finds natives. And he brings them back to Spain, and he tells the crown, look, I found gold, and I found natives. That means converts, and that means income for Spain, and Spain desperately needs these things. Now, we all sort of know how this plays out, but in order to understand why it plays out the way it does, we need to understand how European society was structured at the time. We're going to talk about the classes of Europe, and the classes of Europe at this during this period of time. And I'm giving you this graph here, and this is a graph that's going to come up again and again, so it's good that you familiarize yourself with it. And this graph, generally speaking, divides European society into 4 main groups. You have urban and rural subcategories and rich and poor subcategories. And so the urban rich, these are traders. These are individuals who own businesses, who make a profit off of buying and selling goods. They don't necessarily work for a living. They don't get a salary. They make money on profit. Whereas workers is the easiest to understand. They work for someone else who pays for their wages. In rural societies, it doesn't work quite that way. Because there's no real exchange of currency. There's no real money in rural society. These are societies that are predicated on land. And so nobles own lots and lots and lots of land. But in order to make a profit off of land, you need people to work on it. And nobles don't want to do that. And so what peasants do is they work the land for the Lord and give him a cut of what they grow. And so, generally speaking, nobles acquire lots and lots and lots of taxes this way without necessarily doing anything. They just own the land. The land is given to them by the king or a higher lord for them to manage. Now, keeping this in mind, we're going to be able to understand the conquistador system and conquistadors. Now, what are conquistadors? Well, the primary purpose of the conquistadors is the acquisition of gold. This is both for personal enrichment and for the kingdom. And something you might notice is that conquistador is a bit of a pun. So, those of you who speak Spanish will know this already, but conquistador is a Spanish word for conqueror. But it's also a pun because the word oro is gold in Spanish. And so conquistador is also the gold conquest. They are gold conquerors. They are there to acquire gold, acquire wealth, and leave. They are not colonists. The colonists will come later. Conquistadors are not there to build. Think about it this way. If I'm a colonist and I cross the Atlantic and I find an area to colonize, I'm not going to go around killing everyone and stripping the land of its resources and leaving. Because, number one, I'm an unscrupulous person. I need these people to work for me. And number two, I'm not going to strip the land of its resources because I need to work with those resources. But conquistadors don't think like that. They're in this for a quick buck. They're there to acquire as much wealth as they can and leave. They're looking for El Dorado. They don't want to build farmhouses. And you sort of see this in Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a friar who was looking at the conquistador system very critically. And he says that the ultimate goal that incited the Spaniards to endeavor in the extirpation and desolation of the natives was gold only, that thereby growing rich in a short time, that they might arrive at such degrees and dignities that there were no way consistent with their persons. Essentially, what Bartolomé de las Casas is saying is they're there to get rich quickly or die in the process. And it's very clear that these conquistadors belong predominantly to those urban classes, those classes that care a lot about wealth, specifically the urban wealthy, the urban rich classes, individuals who could read and write and had some knowledge of tactics and whatnot, but didn't care about starting farms and starting plantations. They were there to acquire as much gold as possible and then leave. And I'm going to tell you 3 stories that really prove this point. And some of these you may be familiar with. Hernan Cortez is famous for essentially destroying the Aztec civilization. Francisco Pizarro in the conquest of the Incas in Peru. And Hernando de Soto, perhaps the most tragic of these 3, and his conquest in Mississippi and the southern United States. Let's start with Hernan Cortez. Now, Cortez travels to Cuba from Spain, and he spent a lot of money crossing the Atlantic, and he finds himself stuck in Cuba. Cuba is one of the first sort of colonies that Spain creates in the first 50 years after after Columbus discovers it, and he finds himself sort of stuck. He can't keep going. He can't move on without the governor's permission, and the governor doesn't want to give it to him in order for him to go and seek riches on other islands, or as we'll see on the mainland. Cortez decides to go anyway. He gets a whole group of his friends. They got on a boat, and essentially they illegally leave Cuba to invade Mexico. And they land on the coast of Mexico. Now you may be thinking, in spite of the technological superiority, which we're going to look at in the discussion section for this module on a separate occasion, you might think that, how is this possible? In spite of the technological advantage, it's still only 100 people versus a complex empire in Central America. They should have stood no chance. How is Cortez successful? Well, it's very simple. In order to understand why Cortez is successful, we need to understand how Aztec society was structured. Aztec society was structured essentially, and this isn't particularly controversial, on the ritualistic sacrifice of individuals, which according to their religion was designed to stave off the apocalypse, feed the gods so that the god won't destroy the world. Now, the Aztecs were not particularly keen on sacrificing their own people, so their whole construct of empire was partially designed to bring in victims to sacrifice. Now, if you're a subject in the Aztec Empire, your life is not good, right? Keep in mind that, it's 2 kids every month sent to Tenochtitlan to be sacrificed. That creates a lot of resentment. But you put up with the resentment because it's your religion. What are you going to do? And then along comes a man, lands on the coast, with armor which you've never seen before, on horseback, an animal you've never seen before, and with a magic stick that shoots people from a distance. Clearly, this person is a god. And when Hernan Cortez says, "I don't want your kids, take me to your leader," where do you think these very angry individuals pointed him to? Hernan Cortez isn't successful because he leads an invasion. Hernan Cortez is successful because he leads a revolution by the Aztecs against the Aztecs. And he is successful. He's able to raid Tenochtitlan and kill the last king of the Aztecs, Montezuma, and sack the city and acquire as much gold as possible and destroy that empire. You see a similar story happen with Francisco Pizarro and the Incas. After the conquest of Mexico is completed, Pizarro decides to venture south into South America. And along the mountains, he travels into what was then the Inca Empire. And again, you have a similar story. The Inca Empire was not built on ritualistic sacrifice, but still you have this conception of the Spaniards being viewed as deities. And so when word spreads that these deities have arrived in the Inca Empire, the emperor, Atahualpa, obviously wants to go meet them. And when he does, he is promptly killed by Francisco Pizarro, who very quickly seizes control of the Inca Empire and again destroys the Inca Empire. Now, the most tragic story, both of these stories are tragic, but the most tragic story is that of Hernando de Soto. Because de Soto sort of says to himself, after Pizarro ventures south, and he says, well, Cortez went to Mexico and got rich. Pizarro went south from Mexico and became even richer. I'm going to go north. Hernando de Soto is the first conquistador to cross the Rio Grande from Mexico into Texas. And Hernando de Soto travels all along that coastline, from Texas all along what is the modern-day Bible Belt, down into Florida, and then from Florida sails back to Cuba, and finds exactly 0 gold. And there's a simple reason for that. Gold is found in mountains and in mountainous areas. And if any of you have been to the South, you can probably attest to this. There are no mountains over there. There's not a one. It's flat. It's marsh. It's not a mountainous area. And so De Soto was demanding to see the gold and the riches of individuals who had never seen gold in their lives and had no idea what gold was. And De Soto became convinced that these people were lying to him. And so he tortured them and he exterminated them. We only know about the story because Hernando de Soto kept diaries and wrote this all down, but he didn't bother, writing down the names of these tribes. So many of these tribes are lost to history. We have no idea what their names are or, what their culture is really. I mean, we can sort of look at the archaeological evidence, but we have very little to tell us about who these people were and what their culture was about. And, for his trouble, Hernando de Soto finds exactly nothing. And it sort of shows the inherent flaws in the conquistador system. Because, again, the conquistador system is predicated on the acquisition of gold. But where there was no gold to be found, these people were just destroyers. They went in and destroyed, and if they could find gold, great. But if they couldn't, the expedition did not pay for itself. Now, I'm going to wrap this up by referencing the Columbian Exchange. And this is perhaps the most important consequence of this first wave of conquistadors. Because, generally speaking, the Columbian Exchange references the exchange of goods, plants, peoples, animals, cultures, and diseases that resulted both directly and indirectly from Columbus's expedition. So all of this exchange of goods, peoples, plants, and animals that went both ways. I want to make this clear. Just as, things like the tomato and the pumpkin crossed the Atlantic, into Europe, horses and pigs and cattle and goats and sheep and chickens crossed the Atlantic the other way and moved to the New World. And so this is very much an exchange. Now, obviously, this exchange ended very poorly for one group of people. And we're going to look at that in the discussion section for this module, because when we look at guns, germs, and steel and what that means, it's a very deterministic view of history, and it's something that is very interesting to discuss. But generally speaking, in order to understand the conquistador system, you really need to understand how we got here, right? And so understanding how these classes affect the conception of the conquistadors going in. And I really cannot stress this enough. These people are not colonists. The colonists come later. The colonists come after the conquistadors have swept through, and the colonists sort of sweep up behind them, and they form colonial empires. They form the plantation system that we're going to talk about, not in our next lecture, but in the lecture after that. But sort of to reference Guns, Dribs, and Steel, when these colonists come in and they set up plantations, they're there to sort of follow that feudal model that we saw in Europe, where they own land and they have labor working the land and giving the plantation owner, in this case, a cut of what is grown. They sort of take that model wholesale. But these individuals don't cross the Atlantic to be farmers themselves, right? You're not going to cross the Atlantic and spend maybe your life savings crossing the Atlantic to do the exact same thing you were doing at home. And so what these individuals do is they begin bringing in natives to work the fields. But as we see in our discussion section, these natives keep dying because of disease. Now, we know why, but at the time, these colonists had no idea why. All they knew is that when they brought natives from, most often forcibly, from villages into plantations, they lasted maybe a month or 2 months. They did not last long. And so this begins to create the demand for an alternative source of labor. And we're going to talk about that in the lecture after next, when we talk about the rise of the transatlantic slave trade and what that means. So I hope this lecture was good and that you understood all of the themes. I will get started on the discussion sections and the key question for this module, and I'll catch you in the next one.